I'm not really into detective shows, but I still really enjoyed this, because this thing is good enough to transcend its genre, and it seems people largely agree with me. But while the general consensus on this show is that season 1 is great, season 2 is considering varying degrees of just fine to mediocre, depending on who you ask. While this was good enough to surpass its genre, trust me when I say, this one was really just another detective show. To summarize season 2 as quickly as possible, starting with the protagonists, there are four this time, and given that hereditary damage is one of the core underlying themes of the story, the characters can be categorized by the type of damage inflicted from the parent they had. Neglectful father, absent father, spiteful mother, grew up in her dad's weird hippie compound. BT dub, since we got four protagonists, I'm going to be playing a lot of Hollywood squares with these people, just a heads up. Each one of these characters carry varying degrees of baggage that both stunts personal growth and harms their relationship to others. To summarize their baggage in the easiest way possible, this guy hates his miserable existence at the bottom of a revenge death spiral and suffers from a degree of metaphorical impotency. This guy hates being both metaphorically and literally impotent. This guy hates not being into women, and this guy hates being a woman. It's varying degrees of psychological and intimate frustration down the board with these four. Not being able to keep in line with the modern perception of masculinity is an alleged flaw that all these characters share. With each of these characters, the frustration comes from a fundamental lack of control, and each employs their own unique coping mechanism. This guy uses ED pills and convinces himself that this is everything he's supposed to want. This guy uses alcohol and violence. This guy cloisters herself with knives and emotional distancing. And this guy hides his frustrations behind money and status. To give a quick outline of the plot, local gang lord Vince Vaughn covertly transfers his dirty money with no method of accountability to a not-so-friendly ghost. And when the ghost suddenly vanishes, as ghosts are prone to do, Vince obviously becomes upset.
Fucking Casper.
His death prompts an investigation that multiple competing parties become deeply invested in. They finally manage to find a lead that results in a fight that's so cartoonish, it makes a climax of Who Goes There look like a Ken Burns documentary. The case is left in a state where they're told by the authoritative entities that all loose ends have been tied, until the unanswered questions compound into a new effort that's being actively fought against by the powers who are invested in covering it up. Hey, wait a minute! Yeah, in terms of basic narrative scaffolding, it's very similar to the first season. But that's not what ended up holding it back. The best way to analyze the season's failings is to look at why the first one was so good. Season 1 worked as a simple but engaging crime story, coded in abstract pessimistic philosophy, told in part by a compelling cynic. It was shot by one of the best modern television directors, told in a well-paced framing narrative, with some really solid makeup and effects, all presented in the well-respected but critically undersaturated Southern Gothic genre. Season 2 had none of that, and that's okay if these absences are properly filled, but that obviously wasn't the case. The story is more complicated, requiring more time spent on exposition to build a narrative structure, and the result honestly doesn't warrant all that extra screen time spent on it. Its philosophy is fine on the surface, but never really delivers in any meaningful way. Speaking of fully developed philosophies, none of these characters can fill the rusted, coal-shaped void left in the roster. This man is a cartoon character. This guy, outside of one interesting monologue, just sort of exists, becoming a narrative black hole that never gives back that time investment that the show gives him. These two don't ever seem to be able to carry the narrative weight put on either of them. In terms of visual design, the show is shot by an assortment of directors who never really capture a unique visual quality like in the original. Despite being more chronologically straightforward, it doesn't handle its pacing or structure as well as the first season that bounced between three distinct time periods. The effects weren't particularly impressive during the one part that actually warranted them, and the transition from the visual and thematic depth of the Southern Gothic genre to just a regular limited run procedural drama that could honestly occur in any town with an industrial center is just a final nail in the coffin. The problem wasn't that this was done poorly, the problem was that there's nothing of substance here. There's nothing that makes this material stand out other than having a showrunner who isn't just some studio producer. Which, yeah, I appreciate the fact that this felt different from watching a more bare bones procedural, but it's just not enough to follow up to this thing. And it becomes just another show that requires an asterisk when I talk about it to make sure people know I'm only referring to the good seasons. I'd give it at least I was able to discover Lyra Lynn from this, out of 10.